Welcome to the first part of a lore series I'll be doing for Trench Crusade. I want to say that I've really enjoyed the Trench Crusade lore, and I'm going to be getting into the weeds a little bit about the theology and the history of Christianity. Much of it begins with the Crusades. While I'm not going to be getting too much into the history, but more the theology side. There is a rich theological sort of tradition that they've pulled into the lore, and I want to take some time and sort of dig into some of the inspirations for this very strange story that oddly feels strangely familiar. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not going to be covering everything from, every faction in Trench Crusade. I really want to keep this first part very focused. I also want to say that there are many different ways to look at this lore. What I found is the easiest way for me to sort of start off is to talk about some of the fundamental aspects of the lore. And a great way to do that is to begin with Dante and Milton. And they're two works that are very pivotal to not just Christianity, but Western culture, and that is the Divine Comedy and Paradise Lost. And again, I want to say that there is a lot that I won't be covering when it comes to the core, Beelzebub, Trench Pilgrims, Metachrists. There is so much references in this lore, so if I leave something out, first of all, let me know. You can always like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you think. But also try to know that I am going to be trying to make more of these, if you guys would like it. And sort of continue from there. But for now, let's just sort of get into this first introduction. Now, I do want to provide a disclaimer here. Trench Crusade's lore can be very sensitive. It deals with Christianity, Islam, and several other faiths, and there's including even just history. Even the history of the Crusades were it's a touchy subject for some people. So when I am talking about these two pieces, I want to say a few things. One, this is my when I discuss the Divine Comedy and Paradise Lost, I want everyone to know that I'm not intending to give any sort of theological, religious, or political, or ethical, or moral system support. I don't want to give any support to these systems, including those discussed in these epic poems. I want to take these two very important pieces of work, for better or for worse, some would argue, and simply analyze them through Trench Crusade's references and look at them as historical pieces. Both of these poems have been criticized, have been censored, even banned by religious and secular authorities in the past, and that's because they, if you read them, I would just advise you that these two poems, they are mature looks at very difficult questions in Christianity by two men who also grew up in very different points in history. And I want to say that some of their views are pretty shocking by today's standards. So just read and study them with your own risk, and my advice to them is to look at them as historical pieces more than anything else. Now, these two poems, I want to first off and say that a lot of ink has been spilled. Many people have covered these two poems. I think, like I said, for better or for worse, both of these poems are very central to Western culture. So when I'm not going to try to cover everything about this material in both of the poems. I want to keep it as brief as possible. So there are things that, people are going to say, why didn't you include this? Well, this, there is just so much just in these two poems that you could just sort of read. So when I say that, like I said, I would really say it's a great way to understand Western history's the intellectual thought process that was happening at those two periods in time. With that in mind, let's sort of acknowledge some of the similarities in these poems. Both of these are Christian. Dante and Milton were both Christian. Both of them as well are both theological, moral, ethical, and political treatises. These poems have aspects that they aren't just theological, or even moral or ethical, but there are very clear political implications that go on in both of these poems. And both of them, of course, leverage Virgil's Aeneid heavily, That's sort of referenced both with Milton just admitting it at the beginning, and of course, we know that Dante as well has Virgil travel with him through the Inferno and through Purgatory here. So the structure of the poems and the way they leverage it are very similar. With that in mind, I do want to say that these poems are also polar opposites in what they discuss. Both of these poems, one of which is Dante's, generally coming from Catholicism's social gospel, I would say, whereas Milton is very much influenced by Calvinism and sort of a personal salvation. Now, I won't get into some of the nuances about Calvin's experience and his experience with Calvinism, but there's no doubt about that there are sort of a Calvinistic aspects to his belief system. One of which, with Dante, is a clear call for order, and a pretty strong one here. Dante is a person here who equated secular order on equal footing with spiritual, with divine order. And he viewed, this is someone who looked at Caesar and Christ and saw them effectively as equals. The two of the poems are also very different in that one of them represents man's ascent. So with Dante, it starts off with Dante being, at sort of his lowest of lows, being chased through this forest by these three beasts, and is saved. From there, he must travel through the Inferno, but afterwards, and even more importantly, he must travel up through Purgatory and eventually up through Paradise to eventually get to God. So this is representing a comedy or a happy ending in which he is able to ascend from his low point up to being in the direct presence of God. The other side of it is Milton deals with man's downfall, right? With Adam and Eve beginning at a close experience with God, and then through the sin of the Garden of Eden, they are ultimately led down and downfall, right? And from there, they enter a world that is very flawed, oftentimes seen as a tragedy here. The other thing I think that is very fascinating here is their different portrayals of Lucifer. Dante historically has taken the more historic view of how to portray Lucifer as very much a prisoner and a beast, very much being very disparaging of Lucifer. And that's a very normal thing that has happened throughout religions in the past, is to sort of be very heavy-handed in sort of making the other side look bad. Very different than Milton's portrayal of Lucifer, which was seen as really a prince, and in many ways a hero. And by portraying Lucifer as a powerful enemy, Milton is actually able to sort of, it's interesting, to provide a bit of an excuse for man's fall. He is being sort of this skilled adversary, and sort of elevating Lucifer sort of helps sympathize more with Adam, not only in seeing Lucifer's perspective, but seeing him as this opponent who's sort of worth doing. And we're going to get into that, how it's very different than Dante's view. One thing that is oftentimes missed, and both of these two poems have a lead female character, and they're very different in how both Beatrice through Dante is displayed and how Milton displays the female character in Eve. Women in Christianity have always been displayed. That's always an analog for human nature and for humanity as a whole. And it's fascinating to see how these two major female characters are displayed very differently in their two poems. So again, I'm going to go over some things, but I'm not going to cover a lot. But these are some of the big points that I want to sort of talk about to show how these two poems are so different from one another. Now, the first thing to talk about here is what's oftentimes called is sort of Dante's proto-humanism. The Divine Comedy was written in a time which was generally considered to be long before what we would consider to be the Enlightenment, but there are very much a humanistic aspect to them. Now, for brevity's sake, I could pull a lot of references from the epic poem. I am going to be sticking to just one particular discourse that he had with someone named Marco Lombardo. This was a soul in purgatory who was at the circle of anger. So in the general way, the structure of the Divine Comedy, Dante asks the question that is oftentimes, common in the poem. For what he does is Dante generally will ask a spirit or will ask the guide a question, and then either the guide or the spirit will sort of give him the answer. And the question that Dante asks is a question that oftentimes many of us have. It's just where the source of evil comes in the world. So let's just sort of start. So Dante begins, the world indeed has been stripped utterly of every virtue. As you said to me, it cloaks and is cloaked by perversity. Some place the cause in heaven, and some below. But I beseech you, and he's talking to Marco Lombardo here, to define the cause, that seeing it, I may show it to others. So here, Dante brings out something very fascinating. Here he sees all the evil in the world. And he asks Marco Lombardo, some people think that this comes from the heaven, or that, in other words, by speaking more from like an astronomy perspective, that there is a preordinance to everything. Or he says some below. Some others believe that it's the devils doing it, and it's demons and all these things that are causing it here. Well, Marco Lombardo responds to that. He begins by saying, you living ones continue to assign to heaven every cause, and if it were the necessary source of every notion. So again, he says, you're trying to blame the stars for everything that happens. And he says, if it were so, then your free will would be destroyed, and there would be no justice in joy for doing good, or in grief for evil. He's saying that if you don't have control or freedom, then what is the point of feeling bad or good for anything that you do? He continues, always remember that your freedom comes from God, who created you to be free. Again, this is a very powerful thing, and he goes on to say something that's very stark. The stars in the heaven have no control over this. You can see that the cause of the evil in the world comes from yourselves. And here he says, and nothing else. Now, this is a very strong statement by Dante, in that he's very clear what he says. The causes of the world, they aren't preordained. They don't, in other words, he's saying there is no sort of fate. There is no prediction. There is nothing. What causes the world? You are free. In other words, he's basically saying that there is no sort of, it doesn't come from the stars. Nothing is preordained. The evil that comes in the world comes from humanity and humanity alone. Also sort of acknowledging that there is no external powers working on us. This is a very clear and powerful statement that Dante, that Marco Lombardo makes. But he also provides the cure for the evils of the world. And what is the cure? Well, he continues. In older times, Rome, which was the seat of good in the world, had two suns. One lighted the road in this world, and the other showed the path to God. But now the church has usurped the prerogatives of the empire. The sword and the shepherd's crook have become one. Now here is a really interesting part about here, and it's one of the primary things that Dante argues about, and he talks about this throughout the Divine Comedy, that he believes that there should be a separation of church and state, but both of these two institutions should have equal power in their domain. And in this particular case, he says the evil that's happening in the world is actually because the church has sort of usurped the power, the secular power of the empire here. He uses this thing often calls these two suns. He's called them in the past two stars. And it is these other ideas. And this is Dante's solution to it. It isn't external. Dante sees the evil and the solution to the world being in one thing. And that is for humanity to come under both divine but also secular government. In this way, this is a very, like I said, a very, very humanist. And there's a lot of humanism going on here that is very, very interesting when we talk about Dante. And it's a central premise to especially some of the political implications of the Divine Comedy. Now, let's look at Milton's perspective of man. We've seen Dante that has a pretty high humanist perspective of man. But next, we're going to be looking at some of the ways that Milton looks at what we would call the wretched man. Now, I'm just going to cover some of the discourses. There's a lot that we could talk about here. I'm just going to, again, pick a few of them and talk about one. So one thing we're going to talk about here is one that that Milton covers a lot that the devil's are at work in this world. He says, with easy intercourse to pass to and fro, he's speaking about these fallen angels, to tempt and punish mortal, except how God and good angels guard by special grace. So there's a few things going on. One, we see that for Milton, Milton does acknowledge that man has free will, but there's oftentimes when you read Milton, there's a gray area there. And there's a lot of caveats that Milton sort of puts in the way to sort of provide, as best we can call it, sort of excuses for man's actions. And one way he says is that, hell is at work, that the devil, so Milton is definitely a proponent, and part of that is his things of Paradise Lost, that sort of the devil made me do it sort of aspect of believing it. Sort of, again, providing a bit of an excuse. While also that he's further decreasing the sort of the power of man, and that he is basically providing a sense of predestination, which is where his Calvinistic influence is coming. That there is this two-tiered system, that you have some who are sort of punished and attacked and by these devils, but then you also have this other group of people who are guarded by the special grace, going back to sort of Calvinistic views of the elect, who are sort of set apart. The next thing that when we talk about him, and this is another quote in here, it says, "Man shall not quite be lost, but saved who will, yet not will in him, but grace in me, freely vouchsafed." So vouchsafed is given, basically. So here, this is another Calvinistic sort of influence in Milton's work, that salvation doesn't come, at the end of the day, doesn't come from man. That it comes from the grace of God. That it is salvation not only to man, but the world is external. Again, this is very different than sort of this tiered system, not only in the Inferno, but in purgatory and even paradise. We need to remember here that while the Inferno for Dante is the most oftentimes known, probably even more important to the Divine Comedy is Dante's walk through purgatory and then through paradise, where one, as going through purgatory, he must sort of cleanse himself of his own defects. And then even through paradise, he must sort of go through paradise and sort of gain further knowledge. And even after he reaches the peak of paradise, he's then tested by St. Peter before he can even access God. And that's a very interesting perspective, that Dante has a very clear view that man has to have a lot of works. Even if he gets to heaven, he still has to have sort of this further purity in works to even sort of be in contact with God, right? God is in the highest circle of paradise. And we know that in Divine Comedy, there are people here who make it to heaven who don't reach that highest echelon of paradise. So this is very different than Milton's view, which is very much a grace-based system, where sort of everyone can get this direct access to God. The next thing we can talk about here is when Adam, this is after the fall, and Adam is sort of lamenting what is going on. And he says, "O miserable mankind, to what fall degraded, to what wretched state reserved? Better end here unborn. Why is life given?" So we go back to a big part of Milton's sort of what he polemicizes in Paradise Lost is that the world is evil. But when they lost paradise, they sort of entered a world which was inherently flawed, hurt by sin, and that man is left in sort of a wretched, degraded state. Very different than Dante's elevated view of man. Milton sees man as degraded, and that needs external help to be seen, and that oftentimes can portray a pretty bleak picture of the physical world. And finally, a couple of others. So one, we have to read this one, which is at the end, there is some hope that comes out of Paradise Lost. And it says of this, "Of the rest, then wilt thou not be loath to leave this paradise, but shall possess a paradise within thee, happier far." Now here's I would say one of the key sort of quotes of Paradise Lost, and that is, although this physical world, right, we are in this degraded world, what Milton oftentimes calls is not only for an external sense of salvation, but also a personal paradise inside of us, that we should look for joy and we should look for this happiness inside of ourselves rather than sort of making the world a better place, because the world is already flawed. We should instead sort of turn inwardly and to find that happiness in ourselves. Very different, as I've said, with Dante's view of sort of this social gospel. So with that, let's look at the portrayals of Lucifer, which I think is also a very fascinating aspect. Now again, we go back to it. I'm not going to cover a lot, but we do see a portrayal of Dante's Lucifer, and we see him primarily as I would say basically an animal, but also a prisoner. You know, Dante's Lucifer is not just bestial, but also hideous, but also just animalistic, and sort of even, I would say, very, very low. It said, if he were beautiful as he is hideous now, and yet did dare to scowl upon his maker. He's talking about, this is in the last Inferno, Canto 34, so he's at the depths of Inferno now. May all our misery flow. And what a sight, he says, how passing strange it seemed, that when I did spy upon his head 3 faces. So he saw the 3 faces, which is generally representing sort of a mockery of the Trinity at that time. He wept with all 6 eyes, and his tears fell over his 3 chins, mingled with bloody foam. The teeth of each mouth held a sinner. Here we see a devil which is portrayed as really sort of a monster, but devoid of any real understanding, and what oftentimes said is the exact opposite of God. And this is, again, it goes back a tradition that's even for millennia. You go back for thousands of years, you see that religions back then would take a point to sort of cast aspersions on other religions, other enemies, to sort of really discourage people from believing in it. You know, we even going to see this a little bit about how even Jews kind of speak of Beelzebub. And that's a very key aspect that's very traditional. So Dante sort of keeps with this tradition of sort of being heavily disparaging of the other side, if you will. Now this is very different when we look at Milton's Lucifer, who we see not only as just a human, but also there is a heroic aspect to him. We're going to read some of these quotes. Now, some of these quotes are from other fallen angels, but, you know, when we think about the idea of Lucifer or the fallen angel, we really have to think of them as one. So, again, I'm going to quote some of this stuff from Lucifer, but some of this is going to come from the other angels specifically. So, the first thing he says is, what though the field be lost? All is not lost. So, this is speaking of the angels when they are first sort of brought down. It says, the unconquerable wheel, the study for revenge of immortal hate. But he also says, and the courage to never submit or yield. So some of these quotes here, and we're oftentimes going to see this, that the angels see God as a tyrant. They see him as sort of a person who is holding over them. And they declare that one of their sort of better aspects is that they have courage to basically to not submit or yield to them. This is very different than Dante's portrayal, where he sees, you know, the devil and these angels as traitors. And I would say this, there's a big difference in, you know, a rebel is one thing, a traitor is another thing. One has a positive connotation to it, one a very clear negative one. There's another quote in Book 2, free and non-accountable, preferring hard liberty before the easy yoke of servile pomp. So here this is the devil's talking about how they saw, you know, they want sort of this hard liberty. And we'll get into just how they really built hell on their own versus the easy yoke of pomp. So here's the other quote that's very different than hell. You know, Dante's hell is seen as really a prison where there are, you know, demons and devils in Dante's hell, but they're really just prisoners and sometimes either used to basically to just punish people. But here we see a very different version of hell. Thrones and imperial power, offering of heaven, ethereal virtues. Of these titles now we must renounce by changing style and be called princes of hell. So that's a rhetorical question. for so popular quote in Vines. So this is acknowledging they have a sort of democracy, if you will. Here to continue and build up a growing empire, doubtless. So again, we see a very stark view that hell is not a prison, but actually an empire, and an empire that the demons, or the fallen angels, I would say, sort of built on their own. You know, it's also to be acknowledged when we see this, Milton again was heavily criticized for sort of this positive view of, you know, the devil and the devils, right? There is a certain empathy and a sympathy that we can gain. But, you know, again, I think there's a lot of people who've debated about why he did this. I think that there is a certain reasoning to say that to strengthen the devil as an opponent is to provide, again, a more reasonable way to looking at his perspective. And it provides a little more reason into saying, well, I can sort of it's almost like saying you can sort of understand and empathize better and sympathize better with man. You know, there's little doubt as well that Milton's own personal views of government are at play here. He's a person here who clearly hated the monarchy, saw the monarchy actually even in a religious tone as being an idol. So there's a lot going. Milton was very much a person here who's involved in, I say, personal liberty. But again, by being the devil's advocate, you know, again, we are able to sympathize more with man and not see his sin as so bad, because you're against such an opponent. It gives man a bit of an excuse. And again, even as he sort of declares man's free will, he's always providing a little bit of wiggle room for man in these different ideas. The next thing that I think is a really fascinating thing to look at is to look about the two leading ladies, if you will, in these two poems. One, let's look at Beatrice. Beatrice represents sort of the idealized man. She is a representation of God's love and wisdom, certainly in the tradition of what we would consider to be a version of Mary, and maybe even comparison to sort of a Mary and maybe even Athena when we look at that from classical perspective. She is Dante's savior. Remember, Dante begins as being chased by these three beasts, which generally are always thought representing his sin, and that she comes over there, she goes to purgatory and gets Virgil, and then Virgil comes. And then from there, Virgil leads him through the Inferno and then through Purgatory. And then after that, since Virgil is not a Christian, didn't die Christian, she takes over and leads him through the final step of Paradise. There's a lot going on here when we think about some of the troubadour tradition of poetry that goes on here. This sort of, but also, again, Beatrice is sort of an analog for humanity and view of Dante's sort of heightened view of humanity, right? In sort of this idealized version of Beatrice. Again, Beatrice represents humanity's capacity and responsibility to save other humans. Humans in Dante's, in Dante, it is humans who are coming to save. The next thing we can look at is Milton's Eve, a great sort of, again, his analog to humanity. One thing we're going to see here is that Eve is oftentimes much more of a passive character. And one of the big things we can say about her is she's very influenced. She's very easily influenced. She's influenced by Adam, but she's also sort of influenced by Lucifer. She has a childlike quality to her. Some people have called her even vain, sort of a vain quality to them. But she represents man's weakness and his ease of being influenced by others. We also note here that Adam deeply loves Eve and chooses to commit this sin with her out of his love for her. And again, I go back to it. There is always this wiggle room, and I always say these little excuses that Milton provides to sympathize with man, which is representing of the reader, and sort of slightly lessen his responsibility. There is a bit of push and pull and a gray area that goes on when Milton's writing here. Well, he does acknowledge the free will, but he's always willing to give man a little bit of wiggle room. But again, it also sort of represents Milton's view of man, that really they're not the source of salvation, but oftentimes they're sort of the source of problems. So, and they are, especially those who aren't the elect, if you will, are part of this sort of tainted world. Now, with that, let's talk about we've covered a lot of these two poems. Let's talk about some of the aspects of Trench Crusade lore that we can sort of pull from some of these poems here. So, we've taken some time and covered some of some of the themes that are happening in these two poems. To be clear, both of these poems have a lot more places that we can explore. But let's just sort of look at how Trench Crusade sort of takes some of these poems. Now, I want to say as well that there has been a lot of recent lore changes, especially with like the Temple of Metamorphosis and like the Path of the Beast. So the lore is still growing and still changing. Maybe we'll understand in the future. We sort of don't know what's going to happen with the lore. But I think a lot, when they released the Court of the Seven-Headed Serpent, we definitely saw a lot more of the influence of Milton start really coming out here. Now, of course, the first thing that we have to say here is that the Trench Crusade lore is sort of the crux at it. And if we would call the main thesis of the Trench Crusade lore is sort of Paradise Lost Relived. At the core of Trench Crusade is this, again, these crusaders who come to Jerusalem and then are tempted and commit a terrible sin. And this oftentimes basically degrades the world, I guess, even further, if you will, right? So now the world is forever changed and just sort of worse. And this is sort of very much tying in directly with Milton's Paradise Lost. That the world sort of at this point can't be saved, and that basically there is this hopelessness that's just sort of spiritual salvation. And this sort of dark aspect is referencing the hopelessness of the situation of the world, and sort of that the physical world is doomed. And yet, when we look at the side of it, especially when we think about the New Antioch side of it, we definitely see a lot of aspects of Dante coming out here, right? That God does not really directly intervene in the war. And that you oftentimes see that man, especially in the form of New Antioch specifically, are having to do much of the work on their own. And this is sort of in line with Dante's perspective, that the world is man's responsibility to win the war, and he's responsible for that. His voice, it's very interesting that they go into, especially when you think about the Observer and these aspects of how it's so difficult to access this voice of God, is very similar to the sort of the structured thing of even Paradise, where God's really at the top, and you have to do sort of a lot of work just to sort of get to him. Now, I do think that, let's sort of say that Trench Crusade's lore sort of takes some of these ideas that Dante has and sort of like turns them to the absurd, right? And sort of, I don't think anyone would say that some of the painstaking procedures to sort of hear the word of God are sort of necessary. But that's the idea that makes Trench Crusade lore very interesting, is they do take some of these ideas that are happening and they do turn them up to a bit of an absurd level. The next thing that we really sort of see that's a very big reference, especially when we talk about New Antioch, which we would imagine to be this, the Dante faction, if you will, is that the leaders, the leader of the war is a secular government through the Principality of New Antioch. Even if it's nominal, that, as they say here, there is a clear leading is based on secular, but it's also sort of supported very, very closely by the church. And I think when you look at even the New Antioch list, you see the lieutenant and the trench pilgrim, right? You see the two stars of the two suns sort of united in their particular parts. As bad as it is, also, man has held out, and they have created what they've needed to do out of primarily their own efforts. The paladins, Metachrist, Overseer, and all this other stuff primarily comes from man's own hands. And again, it is a reference, this sort of saying that as bad as the world is and the horrors that are go on, the fact that man has survived 800 years is a testament to the power of man. Now, the other side of it is then the trench pilgrims, right? And this sort of direct connection with God. So while we have New Antioch, which we would definitely say represents sort of this Dante-esque view of how humanity should deal with the world. We then have the Trench Pilgrims, which sort of represent a completely different perspective. Sort of this antinomianism that goes on with them, where they reject sort of government, they do what they want. We have sort of New Antioch that just sort of lets them do it because, it's easier to do it that way. But again, a lot of the Trench Pilgrims philosophy definitely borrows from Milton, the idea of there is a suffering side of them that they sort of they take in, and they somewhat almost enjoy and relish the suffering and see this very dark side of the world. But it's also this idea that they see this direct connection with God and a very personal connection that he is leading them directly to go on these pilgrimages. So, and it's interesting because we see, these two aspects which are heavily gone on in Christianity, right? The New Antioch, the social sort of philosophy, the social gospel of organization versus the Trench Pilgrims' very, very personal experience, right? And it represents sort of these two different philosophies in Christianity, the social religion versus the personal experience. So let's talk about the heroism of the heretics. So in line with the beginning of the Paradise Lost, which began in the war in heaven, like 1/3 of the angels who basically turned against God, 1/3 of humanity has joined the heretic legions. So again, this is sort of this similar aspect. There's a lot of Milton in the heretic legions, let's just say. As Lucifer had to be sort of make this heroic journey through the abyss to basically get to Earth, so the heretics, to even join the heretic legions, to become even just a base legionnaire, must sort of make this very difficult and trying journey through this mouth. Of course, the tyrant references that oftentimes the Lord calls the tyrant Yahweh, which we'll save for another video about how the connotations of Yahweh, even that name, means. There's no doubt about it, the tyrant references to God are certainly referencing sort of the ideas of Milton's fallen angels. One could argue even that there could be even this two-tiered system of the elect, or sort of these legionnaires who were sort of chosen to sort of go through and make this pilgrimage, and basically the terrible conditions for the rest of humanity. So while the legionnaires are human, they are sort of humans that are sort of the very much the humans that are the special ones, and the rest of humans are treated pretty badly, let's just say. Now, I think we have to talk about this, is that unlike perhaps we could say heaven or God's very light touch to this war, the forces of hell or Inferno have a very much heavily intervening in this war. So with the release of the seven-headed court of the serpent, we see a lot of influences in Milton. We know that after man fell, as sort of punishment for Lucifer and the fallen angels, we do know that God turned Lucifer and the fallen angels into serpents. So this is very much a reference to Milton's Paradise Lost, as sort of calling them these serpents. And in line with Milton's philosophy, again, hell doesn't put a lot of stock into man, even looking at Beelzebub, who sort of hates all life. But we'll save Beelzebub for another time. But no doubt about it that hell uses a lot of creatures that we would call beasts. Oftentimes we see hell's creatures are sort of not mixed with humans, but mixed with beasts, which sort of have their own significance. We do know that in Dante, beast, it's sort of even needing its own episode, really, is sort of the understanding of how beasts are viewed within Christianity. But we do see this elevation of beasts in the forces of Inferno. It was beasts that first chased Dante before he was being rescued. And sort of by exalting beasts, we sort of show that the devil sort of see man as sort of nothing but beasts as well. Humanity is also, they even have a unit called the Wretched, right? And certainly there's a lot of sufferings that go on in Inferno, and that the sufferings of man are used to fuel these sort of goetic powers. And like Paradise Lost, we know that the fallen angels and Lucifer, they are using man, they're using humans as a way to sort of attack God. So the next thing is what we would call sort of Pandæmonium and Inferno sort of mixed. When we look at hell, I would say this: we don't have a lot of real concrete details of sort of the inner workings of Inferno, as they're called. We do know that the Lord does borrow names from both Paradise Lost and the Divine Comedy. We have seen references to circles in hell. And we've heard even that some of these circles represent some of the circles in Dante's Inferno, where there's extreme cold or extreme heat. So we do see some of that vaguely referenced, but we really aren't sure yet of sort of the exact makeup of sort of, like I said, this Inferno. But we do know that we see some hints that there is some sort of structure there in the form of circles. And of course, we see a very clear pulling of Milton with the Infernal Council, right? That is part of Paradise Lost, where they do have these Infernal Councils. And so we get a lot more understanding with the release of the Court of the Seven-Headed Serpent. What is interesting, though, is that the Trench Crusade lore does sort of show sort of the downside of this freedom and this, as we see, sort of this democracy in hell, which is basically dysfunction. Reading the lore, we see that these devils are always fighting each other, always out for their personal gain. And I think they choose to sort of show the negative side of freedom, which is, as we see in the current lore, anarchy in hell. So what's next? Recently, the lore has been branching out into some interesting veins, like the Temple of the Metamorphosis and the Path of the Beast. We don't know where the lore is going. We know that the lore is still changing, and it's still growing. Like I said, we got a much better understanding of sort of the broad story they have been telling with the release of the Court of the Seven-Headed Serpent. I would also like to say that I really do appreciate a lot of the details that the writers have put into the lore. There's a lot of references that I think are really interesting, and I'm interested to see where the lore goes from here. But for now, I'd love to know, what do you think? What would you love to see? You know, we don't know a lot about this Temple of Metamorphosis and Path of the Beast, but once they come out, I think there are so many other ways to look at the lore. There's so many references that are going on in the lore that I know for myself I didn't cover a lot of things. So what do you think? I want to know, what do you think about the lore, and where would you like to see the lore go? For now, thanks everyone.